in my living room. So I'm going to talk about learner corpus research, and I'm going to do so slightly cheekily because I've not actually done research in this area myself to any great extent. But I've worked with a lot of PhD students who have. So I've worked with altogether around 40 PhD students, many of whom have worked in the area of corpus linguistics, and some of whom have worked with learner corpora. Here are some of them, and I'll be talking about their work today. There are others, and I should say that I'm only talking about people who have already graduated. I'm not talking about any of my current students today. So as we know, a learner corpus is composed of texts produced by learners. They may have started out as written or spoken or signed. And some people work with one corpus from a homogeneous group of learners, but it's very common to compare corpora. I'll be saying a little bit more about that in a moment. The key research in learner corpora, I've put some references on the screen. The main place, the most famous place for this kind of research is the Centre for English Corpus Linguistics at the University of Louvain. But there's also extensive work carried out in Japan and other places. And I've made mention here of a key work by Nesselhoff on collocations in learner corpus, and a more recent book by Ellis et al. On patterns and constructions in learner corpora. There's also a fairly new journal devoted to learner corpus research called something like the Journal of Learner Corpus Research. There are also famous learner corpora available, such as the ICLE or ICL from Louvain, or the Lancaster Trinity corpus from Lancaster. I'm not going to summarize any of this extensive research that other people have done. That's the job of a student writing a literature review. I'm not going to do it today. But everything I do say is set against this very substantial research background. The work on learner corpora is very often comparative, and the comparisons can be of different kinds. The most basic and in some ways obvious way of comparing learners is with expert or native speakers of the language. But people also compare learners with different first language backgrounds, often called contrastive interlanguage analysis. What I personally find most interesting are comparisons between learners at different stages, because that acknowledges that the aim of a beginner learner is not to be a native speaker, but to be a more advanced learner. So the more proficient language user is the model, even if that person is still a learner. There's also useful work on learners performing different tasks and on learners writing in different disciplines. And the key concepts can be roughly divided into annotating and qualifying errors, comparing frequencies of words or other features. And this leads to the notion of overrepresentation or underrepresentation, which really means more or less than you would expect. And the concept of complexity, which I will be talking about quite a lot. So this can be summarized as, what do they do wrong? What do they do more or less than expected? And how do learners progress in complexity or sophistication of language use? Of these, I must say, I'm not myself particularly a fan of error analysis, or at least I don't work in that area. I don't supervise students particularly in that area, but the ideas of comparative frequencies and complexities are things that I'm personally keener on working with. So if we look at the outcomes from all that research, again, people have different focus. Some people look at second language acquisition, and there are findings about the order of acquisition and the like from Corpora. Some people focus on what learners can and cannot do, what kinds of things a specific group of learners find difficult when they're learning a language. And others focus on how learners change as they grow in proficiency, what I've called here what better looks like. And as you've probably gathered, it's this last kind of research that I personally find most interesting and in fact most useful for learners. So this is the first of my students' work that I'm going to talk about. It's a relatively early thesis from 14 years ago, and it was a study of different aspects of verb use with a corpus of test essays written by Chinese college students, compared with the Loch Ness corpus of essays written by American and British college students that's available from Louvain. And in each case, I'm only going to be picking out a very small area of research from the thesis as a whole. So one thing that Guo did was to compare the frequency of verbs in one semantic area. So in this case, the semantic area is around the notion of keep or retain something. The Loch Ness corpus, remember, is the native speaker one, and the Collect corpus is the learner one. And if you look at the bottom row, you can see that the total frequencies of all the verbs together is roughly equal, with the frequency in the learner corpus a bit higher, but not hugely so. Some of the frequencies are, again, roughly the same. Preserve is about the same, stay is about the same. But the native speaker corpus uses many more verb types, 8 instead of 4. And most noticeably, the Chinese Collect corpus uses vastly more instances of one verb, keep. And this is classic overuse of a given word. So it suggests that learners have a more restricted vocabulary than the native speakers, which is hardly surprising, of course. Learners know less, that's why they're still learning. In the second study that I'm going to talk about, we'll look at the frequency of verb forms of the 20 most frequent verb lemmas. What's noticeable here is in the Collect corpus, the base form accounts for 68% of the total, whereas in the Loch Ness native speaker corpus, it only accounts for 44%. 3 other verb forms have a higher proportional frequency in the Loch Ness corpus. This probably makes more sense if we illustrate it with a particular verb, but remember that these numbers don't necessarily apply to this verb keep. I've just chosen that because it's easier to look at than the sort of codes for the different verb forms. So the base form, for example, is keep, and that's the one that's very frequent. The past participle comes in verb phrases like has kept and was kept. In the traditional terminology, the learners overuse the base form and underuse the S form, the ing form, and the past participle, but not the past tense, which is about the same in both. And this is how we might interpret this information. Learners use more one-verb phrases. They use fewer progressives, perfects, passives, and possibly they fail to inflect verbs correctly, hence more base forms and fewer S endings. So we might explain this in terms of complexity. One-word phrases are more simple than many-word phrases, and we might explain it in terms of accuracy or error. Learners make mistakes with verb inflections, and Guo did in fact investigate the last point, but I'm going to move on to what I think was the most interesting of these studies, which was to compare nouns and verbs. Now, other people have compared the overall frequency of nouns and verbs in a variety of corpora, notably Biber and colleagues. But in this case, Guo was particularly looking at noun and verb equivalents. This is both words which can be nouns or verbs, such as change or increase. So change can be a verb, he changed his mind. It can be a noun, it led to substantial changes. Increase can be a verb, and increase can be a noun. There are also verbs which have a derived noun equivalent, such as describe or description, decide, decision. And Halliday uses the term nominalization to refer to both of the noun types. And as Halliday has said, and as Biber et al. Have also said, this leads to two kinds of complexity. One kind of complexity linked to clauses is typical of speech, and the other linked to nouns is typical of writing. And Halliday, as I said, uses the term nominalization and also grammatical metaphor when referring to the writing-like kind of complexity with many nouns. For example, here are two ways of saying the same thing, sort of. He asked if he could submit his thesis a bit late, but registry said he couldn't, which is informal. And his request for late thesis submission met with rejection, which sounds more formal and more writing-like. Again, using Halliday's terms, a congruent and a metaphoric way of saying the same thing. The speech-like version has 4 clauses, which are connected to each other in various ways, through embedding and through subordination. And it has 4 verb phrases. The configuration of the clauses is therefore complex, but if we look at the noun phrases, they're very simple. There's he, his thesis, and registry, and that's the complexity of speech. If we now look at the writing-like version, there's only 1 clause with the subject in red, the verb or predicate in green, and the object in blue. But now it's the noun phrases that are complex, especially the first noun phrase, with the head noun request and other noun phrases embedded in the post modifier. In classic grammatical metaphor, the verbs from the speech-like version have become nouns. Ask, submit, said he couldn't, have become request, submission, and rejection. So this alternative between ways of saying things makes it very relevant to ask what proportion of related nouns and verbs the learners use and how that compares with the native speakers. So here are the numbers. Taking 25 of the noun-verb alternates, such as change, the learners use the words as verbs 59% of the time. The native speakers use the same words as verbs less 45% of the time. So the learners prefer the verb use, the native speakers prefer the noun use, but the differences are not absolutely huge. We repeat the exercise with another 25 verb-noun alternations, this time where there is a suffix, submit and submission. In this case, both the sets of writers use far more verbs than nouns, but the difference in the case of Loch Ness is smaller than in the case of Colic. And in the table, this is shown as a ratio. So the learners use 6 verbs to every noun, the native speakers use 2.5 verbs to every noun. So this suggests that the learners prefer the verb to the noun expressions. They're working with speech-like complexity rather than writing-like complexity. Well, does this matter? And one of the key things here is that for learners, an individual learner writing an individual thing, what matters is not these overall frequencies, but is this the best thing to say at this particular moment? So we need to look at the kind of difference that this makes. And here are a couple of examples from Guo's thesis. So we've got this example of whether the Chinese team does good or not, I'll support it forever, that can be rewritten as I'll maintain my support for it as before. Now, you may prefer the one or the other. You may think one is better than the other. You may not think that the nouny version is better than the verby version. It's certainly true that the one is more formal than the other, but formal does not necessarily mean better. Here's another example. Society will be supported by us. Society will need support from us. And again, you may have your own view as to which is better. If you want my view, I think in the previous example we saw the verb one was actually probably better in the context. Here, I think because the whole context is more formal, the noun one might be preferable. But it's looking at the options that are available to students. And I think it's suggestive of differences in levels of complexity that are nothing to do with making mistakes. I don't think we're looking at right or wrong here. And it's a theme that continued for me with other PhD students. So if learners don't do this, what do they do instead? If something is underrepresented in the learner corpus, what's the explanation? Do the learners not say this thing at all? Do they say it in a different way? And I'm going to follow this up with 3 other students who were looking at different times at signalling nouns, at phrasal verbs, and first-person pronouns. Again, going through this fairly quickly. So the first of these studies deals with signalling nouns, as described by Flowerdew and Forrest, but it's been a concept that John Flowerdew has been working with for a long time. These are nouns like explanation, problem, reason, thing, way, where the noun refers to something in another part of the sentence or a previous or subsequent sentence. The noun summarizes a whole stretch of text. Al-Harbi compared Arabic-speaking learners of English at 4 levels of proficiency with each other and with an equivalent native speaker corpus. It may not come as a surprise to learn that the learners use signalling nouns less than the native speakers do. But Al-Harbi asks the question, what do they do instead? For example, he looked at signalling nouns in the area of causality. The learners use only one such noun, reason, while the native speakers use 4, reason, result, effect, cause. So there were no instances of result, effect, cause in the learner corpus. So reason itself is massively more used by the native speakers. There's 117 instances of reason per 100,000 words, only 36 in the learner corpus. So maybe native speakers talk about causality more than the learners do. Well, no, because if we look at the bottom row of the table, the learners actually talk about causality more often than the native speakers do. But the reason for this is that if we look at an alternative way of expressing causality with because, the learners use this word twice as often as the native speakers do. So they're actually talking about causality more, but they're using the word because and not the signalling nouns. And this fits, of course, with the overall view of complexity of nouns and things that we've already talked about. So again, to give you an idea, this is a lot of people in the South smoke. This is from the native speaker corpus, saying this is the primary reason for the poor image of Southern health. And the alternative version with because would be people think that people in the South have poor health because a lot of people in the South smoke. Again, you may prefer the first or the second one, but you would probably agree that the first one sounds more formal than the second one. Moving on to Ke Shan, who looked at phrasal verbs in English, known to be an area of difficulty for learners. And again, surprise, surprise, the learners in her corpus use these verbs less than the native speakers do. And again, she asked the question, what do learners do instead? And this time she used the collocates of the phrasal verbs to answer the question. So for example, the native speakers use the phrasal verb bring up with issue and question as object. So what she did was to search for issue and question in the learner corpus and to see what verbs were used with those, and found the verb raise. She did the same for the phrasal verb. It went on for an amount of time, looked for amounts of time in the learner corpus using things like hour, week, day, etc., and found that the alternative verb used was lasted. But in the case of go on to say, when she, go on to tell, go on to explain, which was common in the native speaker corpus, what she found was that there, the native speakers just didn't say that at all. There was no equivalent phrase that they used. The final example I'm using of this is work by Zhoulan Yan Li on the use of self-mention. This was first-person pronouns in dissertations written in English. So these were university students writing in 2 different academic disciplines, and she compared the disciplines and also the undergraduate and postgraduate students. So that allowed her to have an expected difference in proficiency. Again, there's a lot of work that I'm not going to report, but one of the things she was able to do was to compare individual dissertations in the same cohort and compare the writing styles of individual students who used a lot of self-mentions and those who used very little. And what we both found interesting was whether more or less self-mention would make the dissertations better or worse. So this again is not so much looking at numbers, but looking at, does it make it a predictor of success? Can you improve an essay by putting in more self-mention or taking self-mention out? And of course, when I talk about a dissertation becoming better or a paragraph becoming better, it has to be said this is entirely subjective. I mean, if this was the whole study, you could check it against a lot of people, but this was a small part of a much larger study. So this was one example. This is why I just love doing this, because you just get so inventive doing it and sort of rewriting students' work. So the original was talking about, it's a student in English literature talking about the Forsyte saga. For anybody who's been around a long time will remember the Forsyte saga, and who had written, when we affirm that Soames is a man of property, treating even his wife as property, we cannot deny that he loves Irene. One improvement comes about from changing when to although, and arguably another improvement comes about from making the evaluation impersonal, changing we affirm that to it's true that, and changing we cannot deny to it cannot be denied. And you may want to look at that and see whether you agree that the result is an improvement. However, Zoe also thought that the opposite intervention would work as well. So the original version is talking about the book Lady Chatterley's Lover. And it expresses a personal interpretation that the writer Lawrence, D.H. Lawrence, accuses society of pushing Clifford into extremes, the character Clifford. There's also a personal opinion. It's convincing. Lawrence has done his job well. But neither of these things is marked as personal, and so arguably loses the strength of the argument. Adding in the self-mention, as in the revised version, brings out both the interpretation. We might conclude that Lawrence's description is an accusation of the society, and also putting in a marker of opinion. I would argue that the link is convincingly made. And I think that this suggests that looking at self-mention with learners is useful, but that the treatment needs to be rather more complex than I is good or I is bad. And in both cases, I think doing the opposite thing has improved the original version, I think. Moving on now to a different kind of study, and this time from a former student, Dr. Chow Mung Huat, from Malaysia. And now, instead of university students, we're talking about secondary school students in rural Malaysia. It's a little bit complex because there are actually two corpora, a pseudo-longitudinal corpus taking students at one time, but three different cohorts of students at three different years, the youngest students being 11, the oldest ones being 16. And then there's a truly longitudinal corpus where there are the same group of students who wrote 4 essays over 2 years. I think that's clear. And what was really special about these corpora, and really unusual, was that all the students were writing the same story each time. And that, again, allowed Chow to see how an individual student changed over 2 years. Some of the students clearly got very bored writing the same story 4 times, incidentally, but that doesn't need to bother us here so much. So he was able to compare beginners with more advanced in 2 different ways. And he focused on frequent words, grammatical rather than lexical words. And then he did, again, a lot of different things. In particular, he looked at the word that because it enters into combinations that express stance, claim that, suggestion that, happy that. And some of those, of course, we've already seen. You've got the signalling nouns there, among other things. He looked at of because it's crucial for forming noun phrases, and that enters into notions of developing complexity in writing that we've already talked about. The word that was really exciting to look at. Looking at it with the students who wrote the same students at 4 different times, they started to use that proportionally more often. So looking at the word frequency lists, in time 1, that did not occur in the 20 most frequent words. By time 4, it's the 11th most frequent word. It's used in a number of ways: as a determiner, that place; as a demonstrative pronoun, heard about that; as a relative pronoun, the doctor that helped to save Maria; or a conjunction, we're very happy that Lucy didn't face any injury. And we can think about this in terms of complexity. The less complex determiner and demonstrative pronoun, the more complex linking clauses. And in both corpora, there's a progression from using more phrasal that at the beginning. In the 11-year-olds, 55% of their use was phrasal. By the time you get to 16, it's only 42%, so a small drop, and the same equivalent drop over the 2 years for the other cohort. So from less complex to more complex. he then looked at the words that are followed by that at time 1 and time 4. And there's quite a long list of nouns there. At time 1, it's used as a relative pronoun with 3 nouns, and it's used in a verb that pattern with 2 verbs, say and promise. When we get to time 4, it's used as a relative pronoun with 11 nouns. It follows a verb with 11 verbs. There's a new verb pattern, tell someone that, and it follows 2 adjectives. So you've got a progression both in how many nouns are used, but also in the complexity of the patterns used. So having done this with that, both Chow and I were very excited, let's do the same thing with of, but of didn't work in the same way at all, annoyingly. So if we look at the word of over the 4 times, it actually doesn't increase or decrease very much in frequency. The per 1,000 word number doesn't change a great deal. But what he found remarkable was that the patterns with of actually decreased over time. This is the information from the shorter time span, the 2 years. There's rather too much information to take in here. So just look at the fact that at time 1, there is a lot of patterns are attested. When you get to time 4, there are far fewer patterns attested. These are what the patterns are. Again, too much information. So we're going to divide this into what I'm calling conventional patterns, which are patterns that are also used by native speakers of English. Types of flowers, take care of Muna, felt proud of themselves because of his kindness. And these are the patterns that are not conventional. Praised of Ahmed, dreaming of that, jump off to the river, and colourful of flowers. And these are the ones that gradually stop being used as the students progress over time. If we look at the nouns that are used in the very frequent pattern, noun of noun, this is what the students use, all the students use most. We see a steady growth in the just the number of words used. Now, I've only given some examples here, not all the words, because they wouldn't fit on the screen. So at time 1, there were 17 nouns, 17 types. Time 3, there are 25. Time 4, there are 22. And there are some examples there. But if we look at verb of noun, which is a less frequent pattern, we see an increase and then a decrease. From 3 at time 1 and 2 to 5 at time 3 and back and down to 2 at time 4. And some of the verbs that we would not use in native speaker English fall out of use and end up with time 4. So one interpretation of this, and I have to say that this is my interpretation, it's not Chow's, who had a rather different view of this, but it could be said that the learners get more correct as time goes on. And we've found this without looking at error as such, without annotating for error, we've found this. There's evidence that their uses get more complex, as shown by that. But also, in a sense, the uses get less complex, as shown by of. The movement to greater conventionality does not always lead to more resources, as some older resources are abandoned. Now, I'm particularly interested in grammar pattern, word pattern, and a student who shared that interest was Abdullah Al-Khani, who investigated the resource, the Pattern Dictionary of English Verbs, that you may be familiar with, and he was assessing its usefulness in investigating learner corpora. So if you're not familiar with this, it gives the patterns of a large number of frequent verbs in English. It notes the grammatical patterns, the lexical restrictions, and the implicature or meaning of the pattern. So, for example, I agreed to remove the flyer, and I've oversimplified this just for the purposes of today. I agreed to remove the flyer exemplifies the pattern agree to do something, where the subject is a human being or a human institution, and the verb is followed by a to infinitive. And the implicature, which is important as we're going to see in a moment, is that the subject of the verb commits to performing the action themselves. So I agreed to remove the flyer means I'm going to go and remove the flyer that's put up in the wrong place. Al-Kani compared two corpora from the ICL corpus, Swedish and Chinese. He didn't look at, well, he did sometimes look at native speaker corpus, but the main source of the native speaker information was the PDF resource itself, because that's already done the corpus analysis for us. And he investigated the most frequent verbs in those two learner corpora. And he looked at the patterns and then said, is that pattern found in PDF? So in the ICL China corpus, in red, you have the patterns that he found in PDF as well. Encourage professionals to work, encourage youth to be involved. And the patterns that are not found in PDF, encouraging them participate, encourages the teenagers have. So you can interpret that in terms of getting it wrong if you like. You can interpret it in terms of difference if you like. A really interesting aspect of the study is where learners use a pattern that's attested in PDF, but with a different implicature. And here there were quite a lot of examples of I agree to do something, I don't agree to construct a railway, I agree to ban smoking, I agree to use the recycling, I agree to legalize soccer. Nearly all people agree to carry out the death penalty, which happily does not mean that they're going to do it themselves. So I agree to ban smoking does not mean I commit to banning smoking myself, but it means I have the opinion that somebody else should ban smoking. And this appears to be so common in the ICL Chinese corpus that I would bet that it's a probable future use of agree in English. And I think this kind of observation would have been unlikely without the kind of thing that PDF encouraged us to look at, the kind of detail that we got from the PDF resource. I'm now going to turn to, again, a very different kind of study, because I think what has been always interesting to me working with students was when they took a different approach to a learner corpus to ones that I'd seen elsewhere. And this was one where the student Haveen Abdul Jamid started out by wanting to look at errors that her learners made. She was teaching in a university in Iraq. She wanted to look at errors that the learners made, but she ended up doing something much more interesting, which was developing an innovative way of measuring achievement. So the problem was that the texts she worked with were really not very good, and that sometimes they were almost indecipherable. So an example is this one sentence: life is a journey. When we start, we should think about is happy and sad, etc., etc. And it's quite difficult to analyze, and it's quite difficult to annotate for error. So what to do? Number of errors, well, where would you start? Amount of clausal complexity, well, you haven't really got clauses that are recognizable, so we don't really know how to do that. So let's try measuring correctness. And what she did was she divided the text into very small sequences, similar to the chunks in Sinclair and Mounan's linear unit grammar. looking at the so this is the paragraph divided into just little chunks of language. And we find that there are some sequences that are actually fine. When we start, it's happy and sad. We should never forget our experience. And we find a lot of others that are wrong, but as it were, only a bit wrong, much less wrong than they looked when we first looked at the whole paragraph. They're shown here in blue, and they're corrected here in green. And the changes are actually quite small. Life is as journey becomes life is like a journey. When we are in journey becomes when we are on a journey. Happen something becomes something happens, and so on. We don't have time to go into everything that Harveen did here, but basically what she found was a way of quantifying the amount of each essay that was correct based on the number of correct very small sequences and the number of words in them. She ended up with a proportion for each essay, which was a proportion of correctness. The closer the number is to 1, the more correct the essay. But all of this, of course, is looking at what is correct, not what is incorrect. And it's looking at tiny fragments, not whole clauses. Now, this is a bit of that rabbit out of the hat stuff, so you have to bear with me here. We have 20 students here in each of years 3 and 4 in the university, and the number of students in each correctness band. So what you would hope to see if students are learning is that the number of students at the higher end should increase between years 3 and 4. And they sort of do. If you look at the numbers in red, you see that in year 3, there are 3 students in the bottom 2 bands, with very little that is correct in their essays. By year 4, that has gone down to 1 student. Conversely, in year 3, there are 4 students towards the upper band with essays that are largely correct. And in year 4, this number has increased to 9. You're all now saying, what about the anomaly in the right-hand point of the table, where the essays are almost correct, 0.9 correct. There are 3 of these students in year 3 and only 1 in year 4. And one explanation offered by Haveen is that the 3 individuals in year 3, who of course she was able to identify, had been educated in English-speaking countries for some years. And arguably their essay should have been taken out of the corpus, but there you are, that's hindsight for you. So in the end, I think this is a more interesting study than counting errors one would have been. It rewards correctness rather than punishing failure. It develops an annotation that's not based on clauses, so it doesn't encounter unanalyzable sentences. And it's been proved subsequently to be useful for teachers who can start by correcting small segments rather than whole sentences, and then build up from small correct bits rather than starting with major wrong bits. So I'm now at the end of my talk. I'm ready to think about the themes that have emerged through a number of different studies. We've looked at different resources that learners have available, how these change as learners progress, linking the resources to different kinds of complexity, and remembering that more or less is not as useful as right in this context, and moving from group to individual, from numbers to instance of use. I would like to acknowledge all these PhD students whose work has inspired my own thinking and to whom I'm very grateful. Thank you also for listening. And those are the references of the things I've talked about. And I think we now have quite a bit of time for questions.
Thank you very much, Susan. A real or virtual round of applause. Yes, because we still do now have 15 minutes left in the session, that's plenty of time. So I suppose if people have questions for Susan, they can turn on their mic and ask, or if you're more comfortable typing into the chat, that's just fine as well.
I think I might stop sharing my screen if that's okay.
That's just fine.
And then I did wonder if anybody was going to ask me about numbers and statistics and the glaring absence of. But if nobody wants to ask that, I won't.
I'm not complaining about that. It's been a long day.
I think Patrick has a question.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan. It was a really fascinating talk, and I can see you. It's the kind of the tip of everything. Generally it sounds as so you put these this research into corpus suggests that the changes are quite kind of complex and difficult to kind of judge over time as the learners develop, and I just wonder what kind of so it sounds as though there's very little that could be kind of taught, as it were, and that this kind of developmental process is going on. So I wonder what the implications might be for teachers from this.
Yes, I think there is. I think each of the students I've talked about, they were all teachers,
Right.
and they each took something from their own study back with them to their teaching situation. So the student who worked on signalling nouns, for example, went back determined that he would draw students' attention to the use of signalling nouns or teach signalling nouns specifically, because he thought that was something that isn't generally taught. So whereas people are taught, connectors is often a thing that's taught, so they're taught because, and those students have clearly been taught because very well. They were using because a lot. But he thought that if he taught them alternative ways of expressing causality, it would increase the sophistication of their writing. The student who worked with PDEV actually went back with a rather bigger plan of having a version of PDEV that would be usable by students. PDEV it's not overly complicated, but like any computer, online resource, it takes a bit of getting your head round. He thought that it could be adapted so that students and teachers, particularly as well, could use it. And so I think each of the students took their own thing back to them, back to their own situation. And of course, that is what teaching a language is, just a mass of small things, isn't it, really?
Did you get any kind of feedback about how these kind of subsequent projects kind of worked in terms of, or was that something that they tried to evaluate, or just it's?
I think you'd have to say it's ongoing. I do have a student at the moment who has actually, as a result of what they've done that I haven't talked about today, because it's not fair to talk about current students, because that person is teaching as well as doing a PhD at the same time, they've actually gone back and tried out some of the stuff in the classroom that came out of their PhD. And then the final chapter of the thesis is what I did in the classroom and how it worked. Okay. For many of the people I've talked about, as you've seen, they've been doing their PhD full time, come to Birmingham out of their classroom situation. But I do know that Haveen Abdul Jamid did share her work with her fellow teachers at the time that she was doing it. And there's only informal feedback that, you know, we tried it and we liked it kind of thing, but there's no, you know, there's no hard and fast research results on that, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
So Susan, there's a question that was typed into the chat from Sam Reed. I'll read it for everybody. It says, do you know of any research on, quote, non-linguistic features of learner corpora, specifically use of critical thinking in L2?
I don't. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means I hadn't come across it. Mm-hmm. I think that raises a question that has concerned myself and my colleagues, actually not in the relation of L2, but in relation of L1. And thinking about, it's a project we wanted to do and we couldn't get funding for it, which itself is quite interesting, because what we wanted to do was to track progression of undergraduate students writing from entering university to leaving university. And we know that we would see changes, and we know that we would see changes in complexity, because that's what other people have found, and that's what you would expect. What we wanted to do was to link that to development of thought. And I guess critical thinking would be one of those developments of thought. And we wanted to argue for it as in a sense, the benefits of a university education. You know, if you study history at university, you're not just finding out about history, but you're developing yourself as a person. We were unable to convince anybody that what we were going to study was going to demonstrate that or test that. And so we did not succeed in getting the funding. But I think that was rather a shame, because I think it would be a good idea. And what you're suggesting about critical thinking in L2, I think would, in a sense, it would be different but similar, if you see what I mean, trying to link language to, as you say, non-linguistic things.
Sam gave you the thumbs up.
Yeah, thank you, Sam.
If there are any more questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or if you would prefer to type it into the chat, that's fine too. A question from Chrissy Pemberton about the lack of statistics you mentioned. Generally speaking, how much of a grasp of statistics do we really need to study learner corpora? It's a good question.
That's a very good question. I mean, in corpus linguistics generally, a grasp of statistics is becoming more necessary, I think, which in a sense is why I'm stopping doing corpus linguistics, really, because it's beyond me. I think increasingly some statistics are necessary, and I think it's easier, actually. There are resources available to help with that. The work I have supervised has never involved a great deal of statistics. And I think the important thing has been to compensate for that by innovating and stressing the innovation of the methodology used rather than robustness of statistics. So if you look at the work by Chow Mung Hat, the Malaysian one, the statistics of that are not robust. And if you look at some of those patterns that I talked about that drop out of use, their original use was very low. I mean, you'd never get a statistic to work on one or two instances of a particular pattern. So in a sense, the statistics are kind of irrelevant, because what really mattered there was this is a novel way of looking at what learners do. And the novelty of the way of looking at what they do was to that thesis more important than the robustness of the statistical information, because he wasn't making claims about all learners, or even all learners in Malaysia, or even those students doing everything that they do. It was simply an observation about the changes in the way people wrote those particular stories and a novel way of looking at things. And I think if you look at it overall, the really good work in corpus linguistics disrupts previous ways of thinking about things, and often does that without statistics. May do it with statistics, but may do it without. And then sometimes the statistics come along later and add a more firm foundation for the disruption. You're looking very thoughtful, Roger.
It's interesting stuff.
Well, what I mean is, if you take the very old work at Birmingham by John Sinclair that was highly disruptive and said, don't think about grammar, don't think about lexis, think about them all together. Think about units of meaning, think about word patterning and so on. There were no statistics in that. And people have said there was no statistics in it, therefore it's rubbish. But you say, well, actually, no, it wasn't rubbish. It was a new way of thinking about things. And if somebody else, other people can come along and add the statistics to it, and have done, and said, this is the proportion of text that's based on the idiom principle, and this is the proportion that's based on the open choice principle, and so on. And that is extremely useful stuff to do, but it doesn't mean that that's the only thing there is to do. And the temptation is only to do the statistics and not to do the original thinking that has to lie behind it.
We've got a couple more minutes if there's a final question, if anybody would like to ask one.
Or you could go to your virtual bar, I guess.
Oh, Patrick, do you have one more quick question?
I had one more. First, I just wanted to say I'm kind of relieved about what you said about the statistics, because I've just finished a MA dissertation where the student had a kind of statistics, and I wasn't too confident about that either. But no, I wanted to ask, you mentioned in your talk just a small point about a student whose conclusions you didn't agree with, and you gave us your conclusions. I was just kind of curious what the conclusions were and why your conclusions were different.
Oh, this was again the student from Malaysia, Dr. Chow, who has a very strong belief in looking at change, but not interpreting that as getting better. And this is partly, he very much believes in taking each group of students as having the resources they have and not judging those resources as being good or bad. Mm. So it's a kind of extreme version of saying the native speaker is not the model. So if something is different from the native speaker, that doesn't make it bad, it just makes it different. It would be and that point of view, I have particularly somewhere like Malaysia, I would have every sympathy with, Malaysian English, absolutely fine. When it came to, I have to apologize to Chow for this, when it came to, there's no difference between the 11-year-olds and the 16-year-olds in terms of, they haven't progressed. And we had arguments because I said, well, why have them in school then if they're not going to get, if they're not getting better, what are they doing? But that was a difference of interpretation. So when I presented it to you, I presented it in terms of the students have improved. That's not what he would have said. So I had to kind of acknowledge that difference.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, thank you.
A quick question in the chat from David. What countries, if you could tell us one more time, what countries were the learners from primarily that you were discussing?
Oh, well, they were kind of different in each place, weren't they? Let me see. So there was, there was China, there was Taiwan, there was Kurdistan, Saudi Arabia, and China again. So a variety.
Okay. And how about one quick one, or I don't know if it's quick, but that's okay. It's that I suppose I don't have to kick anybody out of here because there are no more presentations after this, so that's fine. Mariko asked from the Malaysian study, the use of decreased from time 1 to 4. Do you think we will get different results if we collected spoken data?
Oh, undoubtedly. I'm also not entirely sure that the number of instances of decreased. Yes, they did. No, you're entirely right. Yes, they decreased slightly. But yes, I mean, if you looked at spoken data, you would undoubtedly find things that were different.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And but the use of was predominantly noun of noun in all cases.
All right. Mariko said thank you. All right. Well, in that case, why don't we give one more round of applause to Susan Hunston from the other side of the globe. So I hope everybody is enjoying their time at our virtual JALT conference here. There's still a full day of presentations tomorrow and then some on Monday as well. I've been asked to remind everybody to, when you go onto the Eventzilla page, make sure you click up on the top where there are links to our sponsors, because that's what makes this conference possible, is their engagement with us. And so yeah, have an excellent evening, or I guess a nice afternoon if you're in the United Kingdom, right? And I always wanted to say, like when they kick you out of the bars in Chicago, they say you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. But everybody's already at home, so I don't know, what could I say? You don't have to go out, but you can stay here, but you can't stay in the Zoom room because I'm going to close it. But I don't know. So everybody have a fantastic evening. And Susan, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.